late. I'm possibly late and in a different track to originally planned. Perhaps blame a kind of time zone confusion on my side. But hopefully you're all still here and all still keen to hear what I have to say, or certainly as keen as you were before. Like I said, my name's Steve Brooks. I'm the consultancy director at Bamboom Cloud, formerly Cooper Parry IT or CPIT. That may be the company that you know us as. I run the business applications team. We were Microsoft Partner of the Year 2019 for Business Central and runner-up in that category for 2020, and we're part of Microsoft's Inner Circle. And the reason for telling you a lot of that is really because it sort of feeds into what I will be talking about today, which is about using an MVP or minimum viable product approach for project success. And actually those Partner of the Year awards and the runner-up last year, those were really kind of focused on some of the work that we've been doing in the partner community, partnering with other partners in a P2P model. And the way that we've managed to have success in that area is with an MVP approach. It's something I've written about before, but not really presented on. And so today, here's a short overview really of what we're going to go through. So I'm going to go through a short story to get us started. Talk then about what we actually mean by MVP. Why do we recommend it, and is it for everybody? And I suppose that's a slightly loaded question, but you'll see sort of why or where it fits. Specifically then, what does that mean for Business Central? And if after hearing all of that, you're interested in giving it a try or kind of experimenting with that for yourselves, then you know what you should look at to get started. I'm not quite sure on the split in this kind of track on whether the people listening are new to Business Central or are partners or are NAV users or people that are just kind of finding their feet in that switch from NAV to Business Central. But hopefully there's a little bit for everybody in this session. And certainly I will pay kind of kind of close attention to the fact that as we go through this, perhaps MVP isn't for everybody, but I do think some of the learnings that we've found from being what I would call a traditional NAV partner previously to moving to a very much SaaS focused MVP Business Central partner, we've gone through a learning process, and certainly I'd like to kind of share some of the lessons that we've learned along the way in this session today. So let me tell you a short story. Now, I'm not going to read everything that's on the screen, but this I think brings to life the scenarios that we see in, I suppose, perhaps a kind of traditional implementation versus the MVP approach. It is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It's not supposed to be a criticism of one approach versus another, but let me show you as we go through. So this is our Panda Pete. If any of you know our branding already, we're very, very much in love with pandas. And Pete is moving from his old system, Sage 50, and he wants his new system to be absolutely amazing. Now, he knows that his current system's got some problems, and so what he does is he just kind of goes crazy with requirements. He's going to document every single thing that he wants his new system to do. Everything it doesn't do now, everything it does do now, every single kind of minute little detail. And then Pete goes out to see some ERP partners to see if they can do what he's asked for. And, it turns out that, they can do exactly what he's asked for, but it's going to be a little bit more than he was expecting. But Pete's okay with this. He understands this. He knows that this is the system that's going to set his business on this growth track. Some of his peers have got new systems. Some of his friends have got new systems, and he wants it to do everything that he needs or he thinks he needs. And so he gets started, and 9 months later, Pete's still not quite live yet. And the main reason for that is it's just been hard to get it right. He's got this vision in his mind, but it's quite hard to really kind of get that out and get it live in the way that he sees it. And, he's getting charged quite a lot for kind of deploying this vision. And he's starting to consider whether actually he needs everything that he jotted down on that late night requirements sort of session. Fast forward a little bit further, and Pete's live. It's been hard work, it's been expensive work, and strangely, he's been so focused on getting this new system live that the customers aren't quite getting what they needed, and they haven't been able to get in touch with Pete for a long time. Now, fast forward to an alternative view here. This is Susie. She's also a Panda, and she's also looking for a new system. She's coming from a system similar to Pete's, Sage 50, QuickBooks Zero, that sort of thing. And it's kind of okay. It does what it needs to, but she's just like Pete. She wants her business to grow. And she can see a lot of big promises about what a system can do, but she's very worried that it's going to be overcomplicated, over expensive. She just wants to get things started, get processes automated, and get a team focused on spending time with customers, but she doesn't want to get things too complex too soon. Certainly, she doesn't want to get bogged down in detailed requirements lists. She wants to make things simpler, and she wants to have a system that can scale. She sees some demos from cloud providers. They understand what she's looking for, and she has kind of online demos, which certainly, as we look at this now, perhaps is not quite what we'd expected, that the whole world would be online. But for sure, a lot of things would have been face-to-face previously. But anyway, this new partner, they say, well, we can deploy finance first. We can look at future modules after that. The idea is that we have a system that can scale, and it's not based on a huge number of days. 1 month later, Susie's testing the system, and the partners proposed taking an MVP approach. Once they know the system, it'll be easier to understand where to invest some time later on. Fast forward again, a couple of months down the line, the system's all deployed, everybody's happy using it, and we're pretty much there with understanding from an informed perspective what phase 2 needs to look like. Obviously slightly perfect world, but it's been cheaper than she expected, as some of the ideas that she had as areas that the old system didn't do that the new system had to do, turns out they weren't needed. So putting in the basics in it as an MVP approach was perfect for Susie. So that brings me to the end of this bedtime story. Bedtime here in the UK. My kids are actually downstairs having their own stories. But let's look really then at what we mean by MVP. Now, as I said, that's slightly tongue-in-cheek. It's extreme versions of the two perhaps scenarios that customers might face, or that we might face as partners as well. And so I'll just flesh out what we mean by MVP a little bit more. For us, minimum viable product means keeping it simple. What we're talking about here is putting in the must-have requirements first as part of an implementation. Then we layer the nice-to-haves on top as building blocks that can go on afterwards. We deploy solid project management services that support that build, and then we make sure that as you deploy through, or as the customer deploys through into subsequent phases, that they've got a rock solid support structure around them to make sure that they continue to have success through deploying those subsequent phases. And like we said here, making the project bite-sized means we can do rapid implementations, and we're very much de-risking the overall implementation. And now, I touched on this a second ago or a few minutes ago, but as a partner, certainly as Cooper Parry IT, before we were Bamboom Cloud, we spent a huge amount of time. We've been doing Dynamics since, I don't know, 2005 or something. And we were very much scope led, and we were very much, yes, we will develop whatever you're interested in. But the big reason that we've shifted to this MVP approach is because actually requirements, both the documentation of those, the capturing of those, the interpretation of those, and certainly the deployment of those requirements are quite difficult. If you look at this kind of slide on here, I mean, if there are partners on here, I'm sure you've seen things like this before. We'll get a list of requirements, and some of them are, I suppose, should I say, stating the obvious. And if you're a customer on here, this isn't supposed to be, offensive in any way. But some of the stuff that we'll see on these requirements lists are like they say on the screen. Must be able to store customers, must be able to store vendors, and so we go through a lot of time putting everything as a must-have when it's almost kind of inevitable that every system will have these functions. But that's fine. We get something like this and we think, okay, well, that's okay. We can do that. It's all standard. But then after these low-level requirements, must be able to store our customers and so on, we'll sometimes then get thrown a list like this. And then all of a sudden we start thinking, okay, planning. I mean, I understand the Business Central can do planning, and certainly I think you can extend this to any other software system. But what I mean by planning and what you mean by planning as a customer suddenly is quite open to interpretation. Likewise, able to handle stock. Yeah, okay, sure. Business Central can do stock, always has been able to as nav. So for me as a sort of a partner filling this in, yeah, okay, great. Can do, standard, no problems. And then you get even more kind of vague requirements, able to handle, high quality reporting. Okay, sure, definitely can do that. Certainly if you lay a Power BI on top. But again, now what do you mean by high quality reporting? Are we reporting on the planning? Are we talking about financial reporting? And then certainly, I mean, again, as we go down further, this list becomes ever more complex. And as you start to look at these lists, you start to think, oh, okay, well, this is going to take some real detailed scoping. And even then, we're very open to interpretation, because my understanding versus the customer's understanding is so open for interpretation, regardless of how much time we spend scoping. So the key point here really is that requirements and the documentation of those can be very complicated. I don't think anybody's necessarily to, quote unquote, blame for that. It's just tough. And the answer often with being faced with a list like this is, well, okay, we'll just come out and scope it. We understand that you want to be able to integrate with your bespoke system, presumably perhaps for the operations side of things. Great. It's going to be 5, 6, 7 days on-site scoping. We'll do a write-up after that. We'll do a functional requirements document. You'll sign it off. We'll sign it off. We'll have a deeper dive into what those requirements are. We'll start to work out what the development work will be off the back of that. But again, there's always that, I suppose, risk that despite however much time you throw at the requirements gathering side of things, it's open to interpretation. There's crossed wires. There's that expectation gap from customer to partner about what it's going to do versus what it was expected. Sometimes the customer expects things can be done as standard, and we get faced with that, oh, I would have thought it would have done it this way style situation. So requirements themselves are tough. The other area that we kind of find as complex is actually the product itself. I mean, this is a fairly dull slide from the licensing guide, but it shows just how many different areas that even Microsoft will outline that the product can handle. And all of these are so loosely documented, not in the overall kind of documentation, but certainly in lists like this, that again, my interpretation of what requisition management, for example, might be, is going to be fundamentally different to what a customer's is, and again requires you to dig into scoping. And certainly in the implementations, if we think back to the story that I told you, if we're moving from a system like Sage 50, if we're moving from QuickBooks, from Xero, from a smaller, simpler system, there is plenty just in this list of capabilities before we even add in ISVs, before we talk about extending the product further with things like the Power Platform, that just going with a minimum viable product approach could still be significantly more advanced than the system that they're coming from. And one of the things that we experience, because of this product complexity, is there's a finite learning capability in the sort of short space of time that's allocated to training and UAT. So when you have got an increasingly complex system, you're asking key users, super users, end users to spend so much time learning what they did previously, and then all this extra stuff on top, that again, it's just exposing the product and the success of the implementation itself to further risk. So really, what we're recommending here, just to kind of recap the point, isn't so much that we take stuff out. It isn't so much that we don't deploy functionalities that a customer needs, but we do it in a more measured way, starting with the core finance of the system and then layering up other areas as they move on. I've got, a bit of a sort of a sense check on who it's good for, because clearly it isn't good for everybody. So it's great for businesses who are coming from a smaller, older, or less capable system. If you've got one of those kind of green screen AS400 style systems where the people that have been in the business for a long time know how to use it, it's escape F1, YY, escape F4, J, then print screen, then, execute. Those sorts of kind of systems where if you're good at it, then it's amazing. But if somebody new comes in to try to use the system, it's almost impossible. Or if you've got a kind of slightly more widespread system like Sage 50, certainly here in the UK, perhaps QuickBooks in the US, MVP is great. Those systems do what they do, and they do it reasonably well. They're a little bit out of date, but they're not particularly complex. Or if you've got a system like Xero, which is a great modern cloud-based system, but it isn't particularly functional if you need to take it into slightly more complex business areas. All of these sorts of systems are a good fit because they don't necessarily have a very kind of complex deployment already. They're not operating in the factory. They're not integrated into the CRM system. They're not already doing all of those things that the requirements list that we saw on that previous slide was showing. So it's a good fit for moving from systems like this. And it's also a good fit for businesses that don't know all of their requirements or don't need everything on day one. So what I mean by that, almost literally what's written there. Some businesses just know that they've outgrown their current system, but actually haven't gone through the exercise of scoping everything out, or are just aware that they've outgrown it, but don't necessarily know the art of the possible in what a new system like Business Central can do. So they are another good fit because they can start with effectively what they've got now, but replicated in Business Central, take advantages of all the benefits that being part of that Microsoft ecosystem brings, but without having to go into this kind of deep scope-led approach. And then just to kind of call it out, it is this MVP approach can be less of a good fit for complex businesses, but I would challenge whether we immediately need to dig into, I would challenge whether we need to sort of jump into a scope-led approach. So, I think I'm probably just kind of reiterating that point here, but if you don't know all of your requirements, if I just go through these slides, if you don't have that functionality in your existing system, and if you don't need that functionality day one, I would always recommend looking at an MVP approach. Really, the only time when I think you need to be thinking about, okay, let's take that traditional approach, let's go into deep discovery workshops, scoping, have that conversation about the approach that we're going to take to the implementation itself. Unless you're saying yes to all of these, then I think MVP is worth a try. And the reason I'd say that is because you can see on the flowchart on screen here, the traditional approach, and again, traditional doesn't necessarily mean out of date, it just means the way that has worked for people previously. That can still work, and it can still work well. There are still projects that we've done where we realized that actually, look, you're putting in something here that's hugely complex. You have that functionality already to a greater or lesser extent. You need it day one because without that, you're going to be doing things on pen and paper, for example. It can still work, but we know if we take that sort of project on, that we're exposing ourselves to a huge amount more risk. And I think that's where I'd say challenge the assumption, because if we can de-risk the project, whether you're coming at this from a partner perspective or a customer perspective, it will be better for everybody if the MVP approach is a good fit. That means more profitable for a partner. It means less costly for a customer, less time consuming for a customer. It really can be win-win. So if you're on board with that approach, it's worth thinking about, well, what does this actually mean for Business Central? What do we actually do when we say, when we've won a deal, let's say we've got somebody coming across from QuickBooks in the US, what do we actually mean when we say, well, we'll do an MVP approach? We are doing away with all of the scoping. So this is literally, here's what you get. We start with fixing the scope quite small. So rather than saying what you need, what you have, really all we are trying to understand from speaking with a customer is which of our predetermined packs of functionality do you need? And by having those packs of functionality predetermined, it means our consultants know exactly what's in scope. It means the salespeople know exactly what is available. And it means we can articulate that scope very clearly to a customer to say, this is what you'll get, and crucially, this is what you won't get. So we can be very clear to say, if you take our starter pack, and I'll show you these on the next page, or if you take our purchase pack, you get what is written here. And if it's not written here, you explicitly do not get that. And that sounds quite restrictive, but actually I think in a lot of ways what it gives is a sense of clarity. And it allows us to focus, and particularly allows the consultant and the super users at the customer to focus on getting the core concepts right. You know, there's a lot of and I talked to this slightly before, there's a big learning curve involved in understanding the posting groups, in understanding the chart of accounts, in taking what was a hugely detailed long chart of accounts, for example, and truncating it by deploying dimensions and understanding really, well, what can the dimensions do combined with the posting groups, and then what reporting will that enable me to do, because high quality reporting is still one of my overall requirements. You can spend a lot of time getting that right, even before you start deploying some of the more advanced modules further down the line. So when we say, you know, let's strip things back, we really are also saying, let's focus on the core of how Business Central works. Because if you get this and you understand this as a customer from day one, when somebody comes along later and says, okay, well, now let's deploy manufacturing, for example, and you have that conversation around posting groups there, and you start talking about consumption and backflushing and all of the things that start to get more complex, you're coming at that from a much more informed position. And as that end user or super user, you're spending a lot more time then bedding the system in and testing on a sort of smaller set of areas. You know, we're not just posting, you know, a couple of production orders through the system because that's all we've got time to do. We're doing, you know, 20 journals, we're setting up new accounts, we're posting 50 purchase invoices, whatever it might be, but we're doing detailed testing on those core areas. And then, like we said here, you know, we can focus then on the next steps, whether that's phase 2 or ISV solutions, from an informed position. You know, I've tried it, I've been using Business Central for 3 months, it doesn't work in the following way, or I'm not happy with how it does this, or the old system used to do that in a specific way, and I know that I'm doing it in as close to an optimal way in Business Central as possible, and therefore this does remain a requirement for phase 2, rather than, hey, you know, Sage doesn't do this particularly well, Business Central needs to do it this way specifically, therefore we've got a small piece of development that needs to become part of phase 1. Actually, maybe not. Maybe we use the standard Business Central approach, and then it turns out that that was sufficient. You know, I was looking at this from a position of what Sage couldn't do rather than what Business Central can do as standard. And those sorts of things are inevitable because people will always come at their approach from the position of what they're used to. So bedding into the system and using it for a few months, I think helps everybody. And so I touched for a second ago on what actually is included. You know, here's an example of the sorts of things that we would be deploying as part of a small, or MVP rather, BC or sales professional deployment. We have these packs. There are more than this, but here's an example of some of them. Everybody starts with the starter pack. If you need purchase ledger and sales ledger, there's packs for those. We have a pack for inventory, one for fixed assets, one for jobs. There's a one for assembly. There's a plus version of some of these as well. So Starter Plus will include things like multi-company. Purchase Plus will allow us to deploy, you know, OCR capture, probably in the form of things like Continia. But if you don't need those, you don't have them, they're not scoped, but they're all fixed price and fixed scope. So it's very, very clear exactly what's included. And crucially, again, if we look back to those systems where this is a really good fit, everything that we start to look at here, especially when you look at some of the cool stuff that's in Business Central, is better than is in their current system. So better than Sage, better than QuickBooks, better than Xero, better than the old green screen system. So this is still far more than what's being used in that business now. And again, whether you're looking at this from a partner perspective or customer perspective, I think that's worth bearing in mind. This isn't not having the full suite of capability. It's just starting with what you actually need, and still perhaps recognizing that could be more than what's there now. So hopefully that's all made sense so far. And I think, what I would say to this is, if you're interested in getting started, and again, I'm not sure sort of the split of everybody on the call here, but if you're a customer or an end user or a potential end user of Business Central, just to recap some of the points that I've covered off so far today, if you think really hard about your requirements, what does MVP look like to your business? And the way that I would sort of think about that, and I'm not going to try and read all of these points out verbatim, but what is it you actually need? Not what functionality does the current system not have, but what am I trying to do with my system, or what am I trying to do with the business that the current system doesn't support? Because that's how we try to tease these kind of packs out from customers, and that's how we try and work out what an end project success looks like. Is there's got to be a compelling reason to switch system in the first place. It's a pain, irrespective of how smooth the implementation goes. It's disruption to the business. So what's driving that switch from the current system that you're on? If it's just unsupported tech, fine. But often what it is those same things that Microsoft often tell us: disconnected systems, siloed data, duplication of entry. If those are the pain points in the current business, then they can start to form or guide the outcomes that you'd like to achieve. I would like to have high quality reporting that doesn't require half of my team to hand crank an Excel download from the current system with 3 or 4 hours of manipulation before presenting a graph to me. I want that to be on my phone. I want that to be driven by live data in the system, and I don't want somebody else to have to intervene to generate that report. So those are the sorts of things that we try to get out of our customers. Why are you switching from your current system, and what effectively does good look like? And that really helps outline and articulate what the new system should look like and what MVP would look like. And it's less focused on feature and function and more focused on, I need to be able to do this, or I want to be able to do this with the system. And then start thinking about paring back from that kind of full view of everything Business Central can do to, what if I just had finance? Would that be sufficient? Probably not. But if I added sales order processing, would that be enough? Okay, maybe not, because we do need to go through the purchase order process. So let's add that too. Could we not necessarily manage our inventory on there? Some businesses are doing that on a spreadsheet right now, so it doesn't have to be there day one, or perhaps actually it does, because it's very much part of the system now. But if you start from kind of zero and build up, rather than looking at everything Business Central can do, you may end up with a different sort of scope, if you like, or different set of, in our case, the packs. And then things like integration is an absolute classic. Does that need to be there day one? If you have an integrated system now, so perhaps your finance system and your sales, your CRM system talk to one another, that's definitely going to look different when you put Business Central in. It kind of inherently can't look exactly the same unless you start putting in the same custom fields that your current finance system has. And that can be kind of a real sort of, time and kind of money sink trying to replicate what you've got now. Perhaps better to say, can we keep those systems disconnected and work out what needs to come from, for example, the CRM system into finance, and then how would we map that? What would that look like? Can we consume some of the Business Central APIs that are available rather than building a custom integration or replicating the exact same method that we've got now. So again, it's just challenging how these things are done rather than saying, oh, well, you're not going to have an integrated system. You still have it, but how it's deployed and whether it needs to be there day one is different. And then beyond the requirements, think about how this is going to land within the team. Do you have the team that is going to be open to focusing on those outcomes? Because if we've got those team members in a customer's business, they're fantastic, because then they'll say, okay, well, you know, ignore the current system, that we just deal with that because that's how it operates. But our big drivers are those outcomes that we talked about previously. They can be great because they really understand what the new system can bring or could bring. And therefore they focus their testing on that, and they can articulate those pain points that we talked about clearly as well. So they are really key. You know, a good team within within a customer is kind of instrumental and crucial to success. And then finally, again, if you are a customer or a potential customer for Business Central, if there's a partner that would like to work on this approach, then they will be you know, a good fit for you as well. Clearly, some partners are more focused on this than others, and again, this isn't a right versus wrong. This is just actually, this is what's worked for us. We've very much switched from a scope-led approach to an MVP approach, and it's worked nicely for hopefully the reasons that I've articulated today. If you've got a partner that would like to work on that basis, then, you know, I think you do need that. You do need somebody that's bought into this way of working. You know, if you look at this from the other perspective, if you're a partner, if you're thinking, well, actually, this sounds all right, we could give this a try. We could perhaps split our projects into those where this would be a good fit and those where we take our more traditional approach. Consider whether that's an option for you. Do you have some small projects where you take the same approach that you would to a large one, but may not need to? Could you start saying, well, actually, you know, we'll spend 3 days on site scoping, and we're just going to tell these guys they need a finance system with sort of sales order processing and inventory in there. Could we have effectively dictated this is what the scope is and still won the business and deployed it successfully? If you think that there are a subset of your projects, or perhaps all your projects, that would fit that approach, then I encourage you to give it a try. And to that point, around sort of requirements as well, do customers always know what they want? You know, that requirement slide that I showed previously, those big long lists, I sometimes think they're born out of the fact that a customer doesn't want to miss something. They don't want to sort of say, oh, you know, I forgot to put that in and now the system's not going to be able to do it. So they chuck everything there. But they're also looking to a partner for expertise. So if you're able to say, hey, look, you know, we know what works, we know what doesn't, we know what the system does well. Obviously, it's going to handle customer suppliers, charts of accounts, and all the rest of it. Here's the stuff that you're going to get on top of that. Sometimes that can be really, that can feel great from a customer's perspective, because the partner's saying, okay, well, we've done this, you know, 200 times before, and, you know, you, Mr. Customer, probably hasn't. Let us guide you down, you know, the approach that we know works. And it could be that, you know, you end up with a similar result, but without the customer having to kind of fret about every requirement. And then, you know, again, consider whether your team, whether that's sales or consultants, can be firm enough to say no to customers for day one. I think we've all been in that situation. I definitely have myself, where you want to please the customer. You say to them, well, I know that technically Business Central can do that, or probably we were doing this with Nav, and I've gone off and gathered requirements and written up a lovely scope document and gone to the developers and been pleased with the outcome without necessarily challenging hard enough on whether it was needed. You know, I've said to the customer, yes, it can do it. They said, we'd like it. Great. It's extra work for us and extra functionality for the customer, but that can end up kind of killing the support guys further down the line, because it's the bit that is harder to support because it's custom. And it may be the area that when we come to upgrade from, you know, Nav to Business Central, for example, is the bit that, you know, increases the complexity there. So being able to say no and to explain why that is the right fit for the business is definitely a different way of thinking for the team. And then, like I said here, you know, can you remove that scoping? And I think I've touched on this previously around that point around requirements. So my final point there is then, how can we divide the work out? Does the implementation, now that you've taken a packaged approach to it, mean that some of your more senior team can spend time adding value to the customer, really digging into some of those, for example, financial concepts, when then a more junior person is doing things like the config package deployments or the data cleanse or whatever it is that you might be doing, stuff that needs to be done for the implementation to be successful, but without having to tie up the senior members of the team. So again, it ends up putting a different focus on the implementation, but one that's more valuable, in my view, to the end customer, because the time they then spend with the consultant is for that kind of really hard-hitting, valuable advice, rather than blasting through a scoping session that for the most part gives them standard product anyway. So just to summarize, I mean, very brief summary really, but we touched on minimum viable product as an overall approach. I've explained that it's suited for a lot of projects, not just the small ones. And again, I'd really encourage you to challenge whether we need it to always be scope led, irrespective of how big the project is, because you can certainly take this approach up into more complex projects. We can still have the extra functionality, the ISV solutions, the phase 2 and things like that. We're just talking about, do they need to be there day one? And if you're a customer watching this, or a potential customer watching this, for me, I think the real key here is focusing on the outcomes. What is it that you're trying to achieve? What's your compelling reason to switch systems? Try not to focus too much on requirements and, listing out, throwing the sort of kitchen sink, as we'd say, a requirement list. Focus on exactly what you're going to need. And for partners, help the customer define those outcomes. Say no more, but offer up an alternative suggestion and really challenge, what's your reason for switching system? Because for us, taking this approach and deploying using that MVP style deployment, fixing the scope, fixing the packs, it has worked really well for us. And like I've said, this doesn't mean that you can't do it a scope-led way, and that sometimes is the approach that we end up taking, but it's the vast minority of cases where we need to take that now, rather than what we would have done for every project. And like I said, it's worked well for us, and hopefully this has been food for thought for everybody on the session as well. And I'd certainly encourage you to give it a try, and I'm open to any questions you might have on it. Thanks. Just going to bring up my screen, see if anybody's got any questions at all.
Thanks. Like any questions are there? It was really a great session.
Thank you.
Okay, so we got another 15 minutes. Any question, please?
Not sure if there are any.
No questions.